How did the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints come to embrace the King James Version as their official English language Bible? The story is actually a lot more recent than you might assume. The Latter-day Saints are studying the Old Testament this year as part of their Sunday school and home study curriculum, and in advance, the church released a statement that surprised some onlookers. While it says that the King James Version remains the official Bible for church settings, members are now not only allowed, but encouraged to refer to other translations in order to gain help in their study. This change is also reflected in the church's handbook. It would be hard to overstate the significance of this evolution. I remember when I was a Sunday school teacher, I got in trouble for referring to a translation from a particularly thorny New Testament verse from the New Revised Standard Version. I hope that this means that many Latter-day Saints will feel more comfortable to refer to these other verses and participate in the broader Christian community. So while the KJV continues to hold this status of not an exclusive Bible anymore, but still the official Bible, that move that had made the KJV the exclusive Bible in the LDS tradition for English-speaking members is actually a rather recent development. So in this video, I want to walk through how the King James Version evolved from being the common Bible among Latter-day Saints to the exclusive Bible among English-speaking Latter-day Saints, a position it only lost, again, a few weeks ago. This story, besides just being fascinating in its own right, actually tells us a lot about Latter-day Saints. It tells us about how they approach Scripture, the influence of broader cultural currents, as well as the evolution of institutional priorities and interpretations. So with all that said, let's dig in. It would be hard to overstate how much the Bible shaped early American religious culture, including the Latter-day Saints. Now, if you haven't yet, make sure to watch my video from last week where I talked about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which was a good primer or an introduction in how the Bible shaped Joseph Smith's early understanding of the Restoration tradition and the evolution of his own ideas. During that time, early American Protestants were evolving in their biblical priorities. The Geneva Bible had been the primary English language Bible for Protestants, especially the Puritans, but across the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the King James Version had come to supplant the Geneva Bible. Now, Joseph Smith's own family likely used both the Geneva Bible and the KJV, but the KJV soon took a much more privileged status among American Protestants in juxtaposition to the Catholics. The KJV was the Protestant Bible. And we can see how the KJV shaped early Latter-day Saints, especially Joseph Smith's notion of the sacred, in how Joseph Smith incorporated the language from the KJV into the Book of Mormon and then Joseph Smith's own revelations. That is going to be quite crucial later on in the story, this shared overlap in language, that the KJV came to signify what scriptural language sounds like. Now, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others would actually say that that language itself is not the key part. It's just the vehicle to give the message. And we see this especially in Joseph Smith and how Joseph Smith spoke about the Bible, including the KJV. He frequently critiqued the KJV as not pure in its presentation of sacred teachings. In fact, one of the key elements in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which I talked about in the video last week, was trying to modernize the language. Now, I know there's a bit of a paradox here that on the one hand, Joseph Smith is replicating the KJV language with some of his scriptural texts, while also trying to modernize it with the JST, but I think this shows an evolution in his thinking. Elsewhere, Joe Smith would claim that there are plain and precious truths that were lost in the Bible. And so the KJV was representing that corruption and cannot be fully recognized as the key encapsulation, the possessor of those scriptural truths from Jesus Christ's time and from the Old Testament. So throughout Joseph Smith's life, the KJV is kind of the unstated official common Bible of Latter-day Saints, but it's far from the exclusive Bible, nor did they celebrate the KJV as the best version of the Bible. They just kind of took it for granted like many other Protestants, while highlighting its shortcomings. And before we go further, I need to do the boring business of my channel. If you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed. I try to do deep dives on particular topics every Mondays. I connect the past to the present on Wednesdays, and I talk about the historian's craft every Friday. The first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion. Last week, I did a live discussion with Dan McClellan, the wonderful biblical scholar, where we talk about Mormons in the scripture. If you didn't tune in, make sure to go watch that now. I also recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter. There's a link in the video description that just gives you typically a bi-weekly reminder of what I'm up to, the videos I'm doing on different platforms, upcoming events, and so forth. And speaking of upcoming events, I am coming out to Utah for the Utah Historical Society's awards banquet. And while I'm out there, the great folks at Benchmark Books, the best Mormon history bookstore in Utah, in Salt Lake City, has arranged for me to do some book signings on Tuesday, January 27th from 5 to 6 p.m. at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City. I hope to see some of you there. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for those of you who do, you can become a member of this channel, where for a very nominal monthly fee, you can get early access to the videos and show your appreciation and enable both me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to continue doing our work to perpetuate these discussions on important historical topics. All right, I think I covered all the business. Let's get back to the KJV and the LDS. For the next century after Joseph Smith's death, the KJV continues to hold this unofficial but increasingly entrenched position as the common Bible within the Latter-day Saints. And there are several moments and tensions that solidify that, though it's far from exclusive. That's not going to come until the 1950s, which I'll get to in a bit. Ironically, one of the moments that really pushed the Latter-day Saints to more fully embrace the KJV was Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, because as I discussed in last week's video, the RLDS Church published what they called the inspired version of the Bible, what Latter-day Saints call, what Utah Saints call the JST. They published that in the 1860s, and Latter-day Saints out in Utah did not trust the RLDS publication, and so they denounced it, and that they emphasized that no, you might have that version, which we can't verify you're actually being faithful to the Joseph Smith's actual record. We are going to embrace the KJV as our Bible, which is one of the great ironies that the very scriptural text that Joe Smith produced to try to wean the Latter-day Saints away from the KJV ends up pushing the Latter-day Saints toward the KJV a few decades later. It's just one of the great ironies of LDS history. And that denominational rivalry between the LDS in Utah and the RLDS out in Missouri is going to shape a lot of Latter-day Saint view of scripture and doctrine, including, as you can tell, in the Bible. But the other key tension that Latter-day Saints are responding to that pushes them closer toward the KJV in the late 1800s and early 1900s is the growth of the secular academy's interpretation of biblical text, what we call higher criticism of the Bible, in which scholars are trying to get behind the historical development of these documents and in some ways whittling away the sacred truths and myths that surround those texts, which worried a lot of religious leaders, including Latter-day Saints. And so in response to what they see as secular academic corruptions of the text, many Latter-day Saint leaders start embracing evangelical understandings of traditional scriptural ideas. And one of those is the KJV, that by embracing the KJV, it was their way of rejecting the modern secular academy. So while they overlap with evangelicals in that way of defending the KJV and the Bible, there are some exceptionally Mormon ways of defending the KJV. And this becomes especially the case later on in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, and that's on language. Remember I mentioned earlier that a key part of this is that Joseph Smith borrowed from the language of the KJV in creating Mormon scripture, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others emphasized that that was just a vehicle. But now, after Joseph Smith's day, after Brigham Young's day, many Latter-day Saints come to see that language as a crucial part of Scripture. That, in other words, that's how God speaks, is in the KJV tongue, which is a very ahistorical way of thinking, but it fit into their religious worldview. And one of my favorite texts that demonstrate how far they had come in that thinking was in 1911, the Deseret Evening News, which was the church's newspaper, published a celebration of the 300th anniversary of the King James Version of the Bible. And in that celebratory text, they said, we know that the KJV is not only the best Bible, but it is the inspired version. And how do we know that it's inspired? Because it has the same language we find in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. So therefore it shows that that's how God is speaking. Just note that ironic turnabout, that instead of seeing the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants is borrowing the language from the KJV, they are now seeing the KJV's language as vindicated because it matches Joseph Smith's scriptural language in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. Although I will still emphasize that even by that point, the early 1900s, the early 20th century, Latter-day Saints still haven't fully embraced the KJV as the exclusive Bible. They're just saying it's the best, it's the common. The move to exclusive status does not come until the post-World War II era, and it's connected to a particular church leader. Those of you who have read my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, or are familiar with this channel, especially my discussions of modern Mormonism in the 20th century, aren't going to be surprised when I say that J. Reuben Clark is a central figure in this story. J. Reuben Clark, I've frequently argued, is the architect of modern Mormonism. And it's especially the case in their view of the KJV Bible. See, J. Reuben Clark detested modern scholarship. He denounced the secular academy as chipping away of sacred truths. He's borrowing from broader American evangelical and fundamentalist ideas in doing so. And so when he saw these liberal Christians in the modern academy produce a new version of the Bible, the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, around 1950. First they get the New Testament and then the Old Testament. It was endorsed by the National Council of Churches, which was seen as the more liberal church, and many of the more conservative evangelical and fundamentalist groups, the groups that J. Reuben Clark sympathized with, denounced this new translation as a corruption of their sacred truth. Now, a lot of evangelicals are going to then support the NIV, the New International Version, which matched their theological background. But J. Reuben Clark goes the other direction. J. Reuben Clark says that to reject this modern corruption from these liberal theologians and the secular academy, we need to double down on the KJV. So he publishes a few years later, in 1956, a book titled Why the King James Bible, which did two primary things in this massive argument. One, he regurgitates a lot of the conservative critiques and theological talking points concerning the corruption of modern academy and the liberalization among these new RSV and other scriptural translations. But mixed in with that, he also invokes that Mormon reading of the KJV, that the language itself is important. It is the language of Scripture. It is the language of revelation. It is the language of the divine. So on the one hand, he is borrowing the broader conservative movement, and there are many who are denouncing the RSV and other biblical translations. By the way, Joseph McCarthy, remember the anti-communist who has his House Un-American Committee, they denounce the RSV as an example of communism and communism's influence into American society, something that J. Reuben Clark would have been very sympathetic with because he was also a rabid anti-communist. While at the same time, Clark is incorporating these restoration abolitionist ideas, these Mormon principles, to reject the new RSV and the Bible and modern scholarship and the higher criticism of the Bible, and reaffirming the KJV. David O. McKay, who is the president of the church in the 1950s and the 1960s, he was actually kind of sympathetic to these new biblical translations, and J. Reuben Clark had to work hard to wean him away, saying that the language matters. The language of the KJV is the language of God, and so therefore we have to stick with it. And Clark really institutionalized that message. Besides publishing his book, Why the King James Bible, he incorporated KJV ideas and prioritization into the curriculum. He urged LDS academics, including religion professors at BYU, to defend the KJV, which many did, and perhaps most importantly, he got the wheels in motion for the church to formally adopt the KJV when they finally produced, a decade and a half after Clark's death, in 1979, the official LDS version of the Bible, the first time the LDS Church published their own version of the Bible, which includes, footnotes to the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and now the insertion of the JST passages for reasons that I discussed in last week's video. But importantly, the text of the LDS version of the Bible is the KJV. And so in many ways, that's the culmination of J. Reuben Clark's push to move the KJV not just from the Common Bible to the exclusive Bible, a position the KJV is then going to hold for a half century. But, and there was going to be a big but coming, that position became unsustainable for a number of reasons. On the one hand, the LDS Church continued to celebrate the KJV as the best Bible, or at least the official Bible. Here is a news story when they celebrated the KJV's 400th anniversary. I was going to grad school out in the UK at the time, so I attended a big conference that the church sponsored at Oxford to celebrate the KJV. But the church's stance on the KJV became increasingly unsustainable for a few reasons. One, very few religions, including conservative religions, were sticking with the KJV. Many conservative evangelicals were turning to the NIV or other versions, and so Latter-day Saints were becoming increasingly isolated, which is hard to emphasize their commonality with broader Christendom when they are using a Bible that most of Christendom is moving beyond. Second, the LDS Church is becoming much more global, and as they're becoming much more global, they're reliant on other translations of the Bible in these different cultures and languages and nations, which means the KJV necessarily has to move from its perch because not all Latter-day Saints speak English, and that's going to make the church recognize that the KJV does not work as well in English as these other translations work in other languages. And third, Latter-day Saints scholars, including those religion professors at BYU, were increasingly unable to defend the KJV like previous BYU professors had. And there were many who were pushing the church, including LDS leaders, to move away from the KJV exclusivity. And you would see some leaders, like the recently deceased Jeffrey R. Holland, who would quote from other translations of the Bible in their general conference addresses, which just showed that the KJV's exclusive status was chipping away. And so that's what brought us to the LDS Church's announcements in December of 2025. So here is a portion from their supplemental material that you can find online that says some individuals may benefit from translations that are both doctrinally clear and also easier to understand. Note those two pillars. Doctrinally clear, it allows you to make sure that it fits these theological principles. J. Reuben Clark would have approved of that, but also easier to understand. That is explicitly talking about the language of the KJV not being the best at capturing or expressing the message that you're trying to see, recognizing that the KJV language was an obstacle to many. So it's still prioritizing doctrinal fidelity, but also allowing ease. The church's material here, supplemental material, even goes beyond that, highlighting several versions of translation of the Bible that Latter-day Saints might use, and including those English-speaking Latter-day Saints could use the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is so ironic, given that it was the RSV, the earlier version of the NRSV, that prompted J. Reuben Clark to denounce these new translations and say we need to double down on the KJV. So in other words, it's probably likely that J. Reuben Clark is rolling in his grave with this change. A change, by the way, that is reflected in the church's own handbook. That, again, not only allows, but encourages Latter-day Saints to refer to these other translations of the Bible, which is a major change from where they were before. I think there's several points of significance that we can take from this change. On the one hand, it could prompt many Latter-day Saints to a deeper study of the Bible that connects them to modern-day scholarship. Where they were just relying on the KJV, it meant that Latter-day Saints were mostly isolated in how they were reading the Bible. But now, referring to these other new translations of the Bible might introduce them not just to how other Christians are reading the Bible, but how scholars are studying the Bible. So as they go out and they get their study Bibles from the NRSV or the NIV, they're going to encounter these other interpretations that might prompt deeper study and perhaps even challenge traditional ideas. The second major significance that I'm curious of is this going to chip away at the Latter-day Saints' sense of sacred language? That the KJV is no longer going to be the language of God, the language of revelation, the language of reverence. Does that mean we're going to see Latter-day Saints adopt a more modern vernacular in how they think about divine scripture and language? Are they going to keep saying thee and thou in their personal prayers, or using even as an intensifier in their talks? Are they going to stop using KJV language as the language of religion, in other words? I don't know, but I think it's going to be interesting to watch. At the risk of sharing one more anecdote from my personal experience, when I was an undergrad student at Brigham Young University, I was an English major, and one of my favorite courses was the Bible as Literature. It was phenomenal, and it was taught by Dr. Eric Eliason in the English department, who was great. And one of the things I loved in that course was that he required us to read other translations of the Bible, recognizing both the literary legacy and impact of the KJV, as well as its official status within the LDS tradition, but also encouraging us to explore in these other translations. And I found that very useful, and thankful to that class. Thanks to that class, I have several shelves filled with different biblical translations that I used in my own personal study. By the way, if you are interested in picking up another Bible translation to help in your study, whether you're LDS or not, I think the NRSV is the best, or the NRSVUE, the updated edition, which has some revisions from the last few years that I strongly recommend. You can find all of that translation online. But I also strongly recommend getting a physical study book that has the supplementary materials, the footnotes, that allows you to better understand the world of the Bible. And so I have two recommendations. The best text for just general readers is the HarperCollins Study Bible. This uses the NRSV. It's written in a way that will be approachable or usable from you, even if you're not a over-specialized nerd or you don't have much background. It's really, and if you want to go much deeper, the best scholarly work I strongly recommend is the Oxford Annotated Bible. This one's a bit older. This is just the third edition. I bought this for my BYU class. There are more recent editions, and if you want to do a deeper dive, that's where to go. If you want to know more about how Latter-day Saints came to embrace the KJV as not just the common Bible, but the exclusive Bible, there's a wonderful article written by one of the Mormon studies field's best scholars, Philip Barlow. It's titled Why the King James Version from the Common to the Official Bible of Mormonism. It was published in Dialogue Journal of Mormon Thought a few decades ago. Phil Barlow also wrote a wonderful book on the topic titled Mormons and the Bible, published by Oxford University Press in the early 1990s. I think this story of how Latter-day Saints came to embrace the KJV and now softening that embrace of the KJV is fascinating, not just for its own sake, because it tells us a lot more about how Latter-day Saints approach Scripture, change their institutional priorities and interpretations, and also how they are influenced by the broader community, and if Latter-day Saints are fitting into the broader Christian culture. Seeing how they approach Christendom's central text, the Bible, tells us a lot. So I hope this video was useful. If so, hit the like button, share it with others so we can broaden the conversation. If you enjoy this nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed. And if you want to give back, you can become a member. History has never been more relevant than it is right now, in part because it helps us understand why what might appear to be subtle changes, like the exclusivity of the KJV and the LDS tradition, actually means a lot more.